Let us pray. Thank you for coming to this beautiful, gorgeous churchyard. Get my notes ready now. Okay, so self-certainty, part 2. So last time I spoke how desire is a way that we relate ourselves to the world, and how, according to Hegel, human agency, wanting and acting rather than contemplating, is a manifestation of that. Life is not a film set. Do you like my religious tone? Okay. So this is still Hegel on the beach. We're just at a churchyard now. First of all, an obvious point of miss from last week, but this sentence really should have caught my eye, but it didn't. Paragraph 163, the necessary advance from the previous shapes of consciousness. So the sentence was right under my nose, but I missed it. This is what I was getting at when I was referring to the way consciousness changes. It's a progression. It's a movement forward, and Hegel uses the terminology of necessity. So it's okay to use the idea of progress and forward movement in relation to Hegel. How much is okay and how much is not okay is another matter, which we won't go into here. But at least we have the idea of progress. So moving forward, the second part is self-certainty. Last time I said that for Hegel, self-consciousness was desire, full stop. Should I move that forward a bit, the thing? Okay. So I said that desire, that's better, yeah. So desire is full stop. Okay, so self-consciousness, which is utterly for itself and which immediately marks its object with the character of the negative, or is initially desire, will instead thus learn from experience about this object's self-sufficiency. What does Hegel mean by the object's self-sufficiency? In paragraph 170, Hegel explains that self-sufficient members are for themselves. The meaning of for themselves is a bit less mystifying, therefore. It means that organisms and people have their own goals and their own objects. The meaning of for themselves and for another, it can be mysterious. I think that Hegel is, in this section at least, is clearer than usual. In 169, I won't go into too much other than to say that this bit is about life and the relationship between the earth, humans, and the world as a holistic system. And there have been books written about Hegel's view of life processes and organisms. They are very interesting. I want to go in a different direction. I think they're interesting also for this section, because life and life processes are not, human society and life processes are not totally separate. I think they are related to each other. I may or may not have time to come back to that. Okay. Paragraph 174 tells us that self-consciousness is desire, once more, in 175, back to desire again. Desire and the self-certainty of itself achieved in its satisfaction are conditioned by the object, but the certainty is through the sublating of this other. Okay, so we achieve certainty through our desires, self-certainty and certainty through our desires, or rather, through the satisfaction of those desires. Once we achieve our goal, we attain certainty. For this sublating even to be, there must be this other. So Hegel says, yet again, there must be another for us to even have a desire. Self-consciousness is thus enabled through its negative relation to the object to sublate it, and for that reason, it again instead re-engenders the object as well as the desire. Self-consciousness has a negative relation to the object, and desire just keeps on reoccurring. Which I mentioned, I think, last week as well. The object never permanently satisfies the desire. 166. In this satisfaction, however, experience makes it aware that the object has its own independence. Desire and the self-certainty obtained in its gratification are conditioned by the object. For self-certainty comes from superseding this other. In order that this supersession can take place, there must be this other. Thus, self-consciousness, by its negative relation to the object, was unable to supersede it. It's really because of that relation that it produces the object again, and the desire as well. And it is in fact something other than self-consciousness. That is the essence of desire. And through this experience, self-consciousness has itself realized this truth. Okay? So the object has to contain certain properties that satisfy the desires. If you're thirsty on a hot day, a cold drink satisfies. If you're hungry, a bag of chips will satisfy those desires. Coldness, or hotness of the chips and the saltiness and the filling. It's actually the size of it that fills your stomach. Those are the properties that satisfies those desires, that quench your thirst and so on. And if you get thirsty or you get hungry again, these desires keep on reoccurring. But the properties are in the things, not in ourselves. And he moves on then from the inanimate objects to an object which is different. So this one has properties that satisfy us, but it's another self-consciousness. Paragraph 175. Self-consciousness attains its end. Self-consciousness attains its satisfaction only in another self-consciousness. So, in the Phenomenology of Spirit Reader, edited by James Stewart, essay Howard Edelman, which I need to quote from, he says, to be conscious of himself as a self, there must be another consciousness. However, it's generally believed that this other self-consciousness doesn't appear until Lordship and Bondage section. You want to get the bondage section, obviously. Okay, but what Hegel says, however, is that there's an independent self-consciousness. He says one appears before this section, of course, but this concept does appear before masters and servants as an object which is not yet recognized as an independent self-consciousness. He says, a helpmate appears as a physical projection of myself. The other self-consciousness at this state is not an intellectual projection. It's got physical shape of an independent self-consciousness, but has not yet expressed the essential independent spirit. So there hasn't been a battle between the master and the slave, but it's still there. Edelman describes this as a physical projection of myself, which is not yet a fully developed self-consciousness. And we've got to wait, as I said, for master-servant to understand what that means for self-certainty. Okay, it might be helpful to look at an aspect of developmental psychology. So if we look at Piaget's theory of the cognitive development of the child, this is me now, children develop not just by acquiring knowledge, but by a mental model of the world. Not a developmental model, a mental model of the world. Children reason differently from adults. A child moves through stages of development like object recognition, self-recognition, the permanence of objects. If you take an object before a kid who's like under one and then you hide the object, okay, the child thinks that the object disappeared. Not just disappeared, no longer exists, I should say. And you bring it back again, it exists once more. So they don't have that permanency of an object. And Edelman says, because these feelings are filtered through the prism of consciousness, where the child has self-moving sense of the world he controls, and since the child doesn't yet know who he is, and cannot make these distinctions between feelings, thoughts and actions, he thinks that what he feels is real. In the experience of the other is an independent self-consciousness, which is not yet sublated into the self. They do not become one flesh. The child comes to the shocking recognition of truth that the other is an independent object. So this very undeveloped recognition of an independent object, another self-consciousness, helps us to explain why Kant and the Descartes model of the human subjectivity is incomplete and therefore wrong, and why Hegel's developmental model is better. So Descartes said, I can only know myself absolutely. That's the only thing I can be sure of. And Kant said that we can only know appearances. So we seem to be trapped in our own heads with no means of escape if we go with either of these two representations of knowing. So Kant is saying that he can't know the real world, just its appearance. In Descartes, he can only be sure of his own subjective state. I is I. The knower is the known, nothing else. The subject and the object are indistinguishable. And if you look at this in terms of the mind-body problem or dualism or subject-object duality, Stanford Online Philosophical Dictionary has this different definition of dualism. Okay, so humans have or seem to have both physical properties and mental properties. People have or seem to have the sort of properties attributed, coming now, to physical sciences. These physical properties include size, weight, shape, colour, motion through space, time, and so on. But they also have or seem to have mental properties which do not have the attributes of typical physical properties. So these properties involve consciousness, including perceptual experience, emotional experience, desire, and so on, intentionality, beliefs, and they're possessed by this subject, by the self. Paragraph 177, just before we get to Hegel announcing his famous master and slave relationship, we get this incredible statement, as I mentioned, maybe Hegel's most famous utterance, which is, the I that is the way, and the way that is the I. And what's important in this sentence is that Hegel is proclaiming the end of subject-object duality or mind-body dualism. During Hegel's time as our own, the scientific method was and is the way to get knowledge of the world, usually, mostly. No problem with that. And modern scientific and theoretical thinking was to see human bodies as biological organisms to be studied by means of anatomy and the sciences. Hegel was aware of the advance of modern science and explored everything, including the human body and the mind. So the mind is able to investigate the body as a structure and an object totally separate from the subject. So we investigate our own bodies, but it's, this obviously the whole book about the science of consciousness. That's what this book is. What is the mind? So a quick digression into the world of anatomy and history. Just to put what's Hegel talking about? What's going on in science and what's it describing in its historical context? So there's an article in the Anatomy of Cell Biology journal, a journal I'm sure you've all got on your coffee table at home, by Sanjeev Kumar Ghosh. This is a very straightforward, non-philosophical account of the historical context of mind-body dualism and anatomy. So the dissection of human cadavers, dead bodies, was prohibited in England until the 16th century on the instruction of the Catholic Church and the King. Anatomical knowledge in England was based upon classical Greek manuscripts and upon some stuff from medieval Italy, where a certain amount of dissection was allowed. And also on the dissection of animals and comparing it to the human body. In 1565, a group of surgeons from the Royal College of Physicians and the Company of Barber Surgeons were given permission to dissect a small number of human cadavers, hanged criminals, because people didn't voluntarily donate the bodies, of course. And the hanging of criminals proved to be insufficient to meet demand. Due to pressures from the growing number of medical schools that wanted bodies, the Murder Act was passed in 1752, which legalised the dissection of bodies of executed murderers. The Murder Act gave medical schools the fresh supply of human bodies that they wanted. And also, the Murder Act increased the number of crimes that were punishable by hanging, which is a good bit of business. So this still didn't meet the demand, and during the 17th and 18th centuries, academic anatomical dissections, which were open to the public, by the way, at that time, in some parts of Europe, and they tried to capitalise the legislators on this general perception that undergoing a dissection was a matter of great dishonour for the individual, and the corpse was rendered unrecognisable as a human, and it was denied a conventional funeral. So here we've got the classic example of an idea of the human body as a machine, the mind as the operator of the machine. The mind and the body are totally separate. The mind gets information from the outside world, but is separate from it. It's able to lay it on a slab and dissect the body. The mind manipulates the body, and the mind is a privileged space, a privileged place apart from the body. And to put that in, I think, better terms, children's comic called The Beano has and still has a cartoon strip called The Numskulls. The website of The Beano describes the numskulls like this. The numskulls are the little people who live in your head. They control your brain and all your senses. So if they're having a bad day, you probably are too. In the numskulls, our bodies are just engines driven by the real people who live inside our heads. Information is fed into the brain, and then the brain gives out orders to the stomach. They have a brain department and a stomach department. They have an eye department as well. And it's the perfect Cartesian metaphor. We all have the illusion of a little man or a little woman inside our head, like the numbskull, who's driving our bodies around like it's a car. And Hegel's attempt to solve this duality announces his first step by talking about the we that is the I, and the I that's the we. He's saying that there is at least one other self-consciousness that's identical to our own. If the I is a we and the we is an I, then there are two self-consciousnesses that share an identity. That means that we discover that there's another one out there the same as us, and that's the end of the subject-object duality. Well, it's nearly there. Now, it could be a brilliant cheat by Hegel. I'm not clever enough to work that one out, whether or not it's a brilliant philosophical sleight of hand. But what I think he's saying is that, and it's undeniable, that you can't exist only for yourself. The I can't exist on its own, like Robinson Crusoe. The idea of a Robinson Crusoe creating an entire civilization on his own, out of his own head, and writing books. Who are you going to write the books for? You write a book. You keep a journal, but you're not going to write an entire work of literature and Shakespeare and plays and films for yourself. So that idea, I think, is just nuts. And having said that, no individual is completely united with the other, and we're always separate, but we're always at the same time attached to others. And Hegel describes these personal identities are various self-consciousness existing for themselves. And what Hegel says in paragraph 177 makes more sense now. The concept of spirit is thereby present and available for us. What will later come to be for consciousness will be the experience of what spirit is, the absolute substance which constitutes the unity of its oppositions and the complete freedom and self-sufficiency, namely in the oppositions of the various self-consciousnesses existing for themselves. So these self-consciousnesses, these people, they're not all just pulling in the same direction all the time. They have their own experiences. And Hegel is saying that spirit, what the book's about, is already present and that it's going to be more fully developed. And he also mentioned that spirit is an absolute substance. So that mysterious phrase we'll have to leave for another time, and we're going to look at the master slave. And for some, that's the key section of the book. Before I go, I want to leave with the final thought, and this is the political thought for the day, which is about this idea I mentioned before about Hegel mentions the word self-consciousness before he gets the master slave. And that's an important thing to recognize, because master and slave is seen by some as the most important part of the book. So if you're like a hardcore Marxist, maybe you think that master slave is bourgeois proletarians. And Alexander Kojeve, who was a Russian exile and he was a philosopher in the 1930s, I think he was influenced by Heidegger, and he makes master slave the key part of phenomenology of mind. And he says we can understand almost everything about that book through that section. And we might be talking about Kojeve's interpretation now. The argument is by Paul Redding and others have said that what he does is that Kojeve talks about humans have got a desire for prestige. We have a desire for prestige. We have a desire for recognition. Now that might be true, but Hegel actually didn't say we have a desire for recognition and a desire for prestige, even though those things are true. He said humans are recognition. So essentially he misquotes him. Kojeve misquotes him. Now Kojeve's important because he wrote these brilliant series of essays in the 1930s. He was a philosopher. He went into the French civil service, and apparently he was like a dynamite, not a diplomat, but when he went with a diplomatic team to negotiate with other people from other parts of Europe, he was seen as being like the hardest person to negotiate with because he was so clever. And apparently he had a big hand in creating the foundations of the European Union. And when he was asked, why did you go into the civil service? He actually said, I want to see how history is made. It's a bit creepy, that, isn't it, really? Because if someone says, why do you want to do this? It's not because you really believe in it. You want to be, it's a weird detached observer, like, you want to look at people and watch them, as like ants, and you're going to be manipulating them. To me, it's a bit weird. And actually, with Kojeve, I know we should separate the arguments from the personality. But sometimes you just can't, can you? You can't. Because Kojeve wrote a letter to Stalin. And apparently he was enamored with Hegel's philosophy, and he called it, he said that, he was also enamored with Marxist, Leninist, and Stalinist philosophy. And he wrote a letter to Stalin in 1932. And what he said was, look, Joe, you're like this world figure on horseback. The world spirit on horseback. Remember, I think it was the first lecture, and if you stuck that long. And I said that Hegel said when he was in Jena, and Napoleon, the day before the Battle of Jena, rolled past, and Hegel saw him and he went, oh my God, that's the world spirit on horseback. Maybe he was a bit carried away. But obviously it was a crucial moment in history. It was a turning point in history. So that was Hegel's take on Napoleon. And Kojeve had a take on Stalin. And he went, actually, the Stalin, the Napoleon Hegel moment, that was really a prelude. This is the real moment now. It's Stalin's the real Napoleon. I mean, Napoleon was a bit shit. This fella is the real deal. And what I'm going to do is, and he wrote a letter to him saying, I am your philosophical conscience. You're doing the stuff that I'm talking about. So therefore, I want to come and see you, something like that. It was totally bizarre. And because he thought this world spirit, so we've got to be careful. Now, I did say that Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, 2022, he represents what I think is the world spirit. Now, I'm not enamored of individual going, oh, this person's great and that president's great. But what I'm saying is that there is a fundamental difference. Stalin is named Man of Steel. He's basically a statue, isn't he? He's dead hard. He'll kill 1 million people before breakfast in the name of the proletarian revolution. Because if he's the world historical figure that he is, this is this misinterpretation. He'll do it because it's history's necessity. He has to do it. If you look at Zelensky, he's a different figure. I don't know what he's like personally. He might be horrible. His social policy is not what I'd agree with. The difference is, what's he saying? He's saying he's going around to France, to Germany, to England, to all the countries that he can possibly think of. And he's saying, look, we need a coalition. I can't appeal to you. I'm not in a position of a world historical Superman. I'm begging for your support. And he's actually appealing to the Russian people. He's saying you need to turn around and you need to get rid of your own leaders. So it's a different form of historical consciousness and world spirit. The world spirit today is one of democracies and it's one of human rights. You can disagree with those people, but the idea of having a world spirit who's a Superman, who's dead hard, who's a leader, who gets things done like Trump or Bolsonaro or Putin or Xi Jinping, that's the Kojevian view. The view that I would say, the political view that I'd say of Hegel and the world spirit is not great Supermen. It's who embodies what's going on in the world best now as a way forward for humanity, not instead of social policy, but if the world's fighting, the world could be blown up any minute by the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. What are we looking at? And I think Zelensky's trying to make that appeal, isn't he? He's saying, look, we've got to win this particular war. If we don't win it, you just count everything else out. Because someone can just blow I'll bomb that factory, I'll bomb the Zaporizhia nuclear power outlet, and I'll blow the world up because I am this world spirit. So I think the Kojevian view, that's why I am going to be political about it. And I think, I am going to say the political and the personal are mixed up together. They're not just, oh, it's a great book that, and you're always in the back of your mind. It's like seeing Jimmy Savile on Jim Will Fix It, doing nice thing for kids, and you find out what he's really like. Of course you can't separate the two. Yeah, you can put them in context. Not everyone who's evil, who does something really bad, can be redeemed. But if you're that bad, if you're Stalin, you just can't be redeemed. If you're Putin, you can't be redeemed. It's not possible to separate the two of them. And same with Kojeve. Maybe he's not necessarily a bad guy. Setting up the EU, maybe he changed his mind. But nevertheless, that view that he's writing in the 30s, I think it's just Stalinism dressed up. Just Stalinism. And he gets a kick out of looking at people who, like ants and saying, I'll crush you because I'm the world spirit. Okay, so rant over. See you next time. Bye.